Edoardo and I mean, oh, I don't know how to pronounce your name, Edoardo. Sorry. Can you help me? Hint, your family name. I'm not too good
Vaccargiu.
in Vaccargiu. Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
And Diana Mazzarella to present their presentation, redescribing early pragmatics, a new look at hidden authorship. Uh, Here you go.
Okay, thank you, Ismail. Are you seeing the presentation? Yeah.
It's all
Okay,
good.
perfect.
We can.
Okay, so this is a talk based on the paper on which we are writing, on which we are working currently, and we want to basically propose a broader framework for early pragmatics and the ontogenetic development of ostensive communication. But today we will focus more specifically on the hidden authorship ability. So how can we analyze hidden authorship according to this broader framework? So to begin with, as probably many of you know, according to the standard framework of ostensive communication, human communication relies on the capacity of openly expressing and recognizing communicative and informative intentions. So communicative intention in the ostensive communication framework have a quite of a peculiar internal structure. And to have a better grasp of this layered intentional structure of communication, we can first focus on cases in which an information is intentionally provided, intentionally made manifest, but is not ostensibly communicated. So for example, imagine a scenario in which there are two kids at the playground, Tim and Alice, or no, John and Alice, and Tim decides to walk past Alice, hoping that she will notice that he is carrying a new toy bear. So in this case, John's behavior can be described as informative in a sort of a surreptitious way. So it's not properly communicative. And according to the standard framework provided by Sperber in 2000, John would be acting upon an informative intention that can be spelled out as follows. John intends that Alice knows that John has a new toy. But then we can compare this scenario of intentional information transmission with a scenario of proper ostensive communication, in which John decides to openly address Alice, looking at her in the eye, calling her name, and ostensibly showing this new toy bear. So according to the standard framework, John will be acting upon a genuine communicative intention that when broken down in terms of meta representation is described by way of the following recursive structure. John intends that Alice knows that John intends that Alice knows that John has a new toy. So this is a fourth order meta representation. So basically, according to the standard framework of ostensive communication, communication relies on this complex, nested and layered intentional structure, which is graphically represented in this slide, where we can see the bigger cycle, the communicative intention, which is a second order informative intention that the speaker intends the hearer to recognize, that the speaker has an informative intention. So the intention to inform the hearer of some propositional contents or an array of proposition in more recent elaboration of the theory. So this is the standard description of ostensive communication as based on this nested structure of communicative and informative intention. And on the empirical side, researchers strive to try to provide a possible experiment to investigate whether interlocutors, whether speaker, and more specifically, whether children are able to entertain this nested structure of informative and communicative intention. And one idea that has been put forward is to look at non-standard variety of intentional communication that can provide some indirect evidence that children, for example, can be able to implicitly command on the relationship between communicative and informative intention, because typically communicative and informative intention are expressed in one and a single behavior. So they devised an interesting paradigm that can provide some sort of indirect evidence of children having the ability to to be implicitly aware of the strict relationship between communicative and informative intention. And this is described by the phenomenon called hidden authorship. So basically, hidden authorship is a behavior in which the communicator provides an information intentionally but covertly. So decides to conceal this informative intention to the addressee. And this ability has been tested by in the studies by Grossi, Scott Phillips, and Tomasello, where they basically looked at 3 to 5 years old ability to provide an information covertly, so to make manifest an information to a speaker who did not want to receive any help to complete a puzzle. So this is a graphical representation of the setting. There is an object that the experimenter is looking for to complete the puzzle, but in the crucial test condition, the experimenter explicitly say that she didn't want any help to finish the puzzle, but the other experimenter kind of encouraged the children to give some help, but in a covertly way. So this is a scenario in which ostensive communication, in theory, is not allowed, but children are encouraged to provide an information covertly. For example, by way of a sneaky pointing and looking away. So this interesting and very clever experimental design showed that starting from 3 years old and in a better way at 5 years old, children are able to make manifest an information, so to act upon an informative intention, but suppress the ostensiveness of this informative behavior. And this test has been taken to be relevant for the debate about the possibility to entertain the nested structure of intention, because hidden authorship is traditionally argued to rely on a meta-representational structure of recursive representation that somehow corresponds to the recursive complexity of ostensive communication. So according to the analysis provided by Tom Scott Phillips, hidden authorship relies on a negative communicative intention in which the speaker intends that the addressee don't know that she intends the addressee to know that some information is the case, a propositional content is the case, and we can compare it with a case of ostensive communication, so acting upon a positive communicative intention, and we can see that roughly from an analytical point of view, this process seems to correspond. But the hidden authorship involves a negative communicative intention. However, there seems to be a developmental gap between the ability to act upon a negative communicative intention and the ability, for example, of mastering ostensive communication. Because hidden authorship is a late achievement. So the only experiments show that a study from 3 years old, children are able to implement these sophisticated communicative strategies, while there are a plethora of findings from developmental pragmatics showing that from very early on, infants are able to at least interpret instances of ostensive communication, such as pointing gesture, and the presence of ostension is important for children to really infer the meaning of communicative behavior. So this sort of developmental gap between these ability for ostensive communication and the crucial test for testing the ability of having an implicit awareness of the tight relationship between informative and communicative intentions raise the following question. So is early pragmatics, so in infancy, based on higher order meta representation? And if not, how do children can develop sophisticated communicative skills such as hidden authorship that seem to rely on a more complex recursive structure of meta representations? So we basically want to address this question by putting forth a novel perspective, a novel framework for early pragmatics and for its development that wants to tackle and to address these two questions in a more comprehensive way. And this is the framework that we call redescribing early pragmatics. So basically, on the one hand, we want to provide a minimalist view of early pragmatics as based on simpler representation of implicit procedural knowledge. And on the other hand, we want to explore the possibility that communicative development might be driven by a process of knowledge redescription that can explain the ontogenetic development of some advanced communicative skill, such as the hidden authorship ability. The notion of knowledge redescription is a concept provided by Annette Carmelo-Smith back in the 90s. And she described redescription as a developmental process by which implicit knowledge in the mind subsequently become explicit knowledge to the mind. So redescription is basically a gradual and increasing transition from implicit knowledge in the mind in the early stage of cognition to several steps, several stages of explicitness. And basically, the core idea behind the notion of knowledge redescription is that early in the ontogeny, knowledge is embedded in procedural representation of knowledge, and with cognitive and conceptual development, this knowledge can be redescribed in a more explicit format that makes this knowledge more flexible, more manipulable, and more accessible to explicit cognition. So we basically want to borrow this notion of knowledge redescription and extend it to the domain of early pragmatics. So let us see how we can do that. So one of the key insights by Carmelo-Smith is this notion of implicit procedural knowledge. So this is considered to be a sort of knowledge which is embedded into behavioral procedure for responding to external stimuli. And she mentioned like attention bias towards specific stimuli and processing heuristic to process this stimuli. Well, we find that this picture of early cognition was based on behavioral procedure, attention biases, and heuristic can find some interesting parallelism also in the domain of early pragmatics, where empirical evidence show that children have a sort of attention biases toward ostension, as expressed by ostensive signals such as eye contact or infant direct speech. And on the other hand, there is evidence showing that ostensive stimuli are processed by way of a relevance heuristic, so an interpretative heuristic guided by communicative relevance. And we consider these two sides of implicit procedural knowledge to be like the two fundamental pillars of early pragmatics in infancy. And we label the two, the ostensive pillar and the inferential pillar. So due to time constraint today, I will focus specifically on the ostensive pillar to illustrate how also we can apply the notion of knowledge redescription. So let's focus on the ostensive pillar. So there is empirical evidence showing that young infants have an early sensitivity to ostensive signals. And what this empirical evidence show is basically that whenever they are addressed ostensively, by way of eye contact or infant direct speech, they preferentially attend to the communicator. So drawing on this evidence, we propose to spell out this attentional procedure that allows infants to tune in their attention toward the communication by way of the following conditional. So if C, the communicator, addressed ostensively, then preferentially attend to C. Now, drawing on Carmelo-Smith's picture of early cognition, there should be like a sort of implicit principle of knowledge which is embedded into this attentional procedure. And on this regard, we draw on Musabifar idea that ostension, at least in early infancy, is directly decoded as a communication market without the need to infer complex communicative intention. So basically, we conceive this implicit knowledge that ostension is a communication marker as a principle of knowledge which is embedded in early development within our behavioral procedure, that in this case is an attentional procedure. If C addressed ostensively, then preferentially attend to C. And in this way, we provide sort of the lower bound of this ostensive component of children's competence with ostensive communication. Now, to recall the notion of redescription, we have seen that redescription is a sort of gradual transition from implicit procedural knowledge to explicit knowledge, which is more manipulable, more accessible, and more flexible than implicit knowledge. So we basically wants to describe hidden authorship by applying a redescription view. So we basically wants to say that hidden authorship can be considered as resulting from a process of knowledge redescription of the ostensive pillar. So basically, knowledge redescription is described, can be viewed as a process in which the information which is stored in the behavioral procedure can become more available to the cognitive system, and this information can be manipulated to support more sophisticated executive behavior. So we can consider the two components of this conditional, if C addressed ostensively, then preferentially attend to C, as data that becomes available and manipulable within the cognitive system. So basically the two components, the consequent and the antecedent, became available and then can be manipulated to support strategies that can allow us, for example, to solve the hidden authorship task. So we basically suggest that hidden authorship is kind of based on the reasoning that given that the communicator have a more explicit knowledge of the marking function of ostension in communication, then the communicator can manipulate this knowledge and in order to suppress the ostensiveness of an informative behavior when ostensive communication is not allowed, as in the hidden authorship task. So we basically suggest that hidden authorship can be viewed as resulting from a process of knowledge redescription of the ostensive pillar of early pragmatics. So this principle of knowledge that ostension is a communication marker becomes more manipulable throughout cognitive development. So basically, the idea is that knowing more explicitly that ostension is a marker of communication, and thereby knowing explicitly that if I address ostensively a receiver, then the receiver will preferentially pay attention to me, can provide older children with an effective strategy to solve the hidden authorship task. To prevent the addressee from attending to me, then I should suppress the ostensiveness of my behavior. So we suggest that from this view, hidden authorship can be viewed as resulting from the manipulation of the marking function of ostension. And this view sort of departs from the standard view of hidden authorship as based on the negative higher order intention, and leaves open the possibility that hidden authorship in terms of intentional underpinnings can be described as arising from two independent, so unembedded intention. The intention to provide unhelpful information to the receiver, and on the other hand, the intention to act covertly in a surreptitious manner. So to conclude with this broader framework of redescribing early pragmatics, and today I just presented a small part of this bigger project, we want to propose a new perspective on the development of ostensive communication, and in which early pragmatics is based on inbuilt principle of implicit procedural knowledge. And I listed the ostensive and the inferential pillar, so I focused more on the ostensive component of this early knowledge. And on the other side, that communicative development can be the results of a process of knowledge redescription, and particularly focus on in the authorship that can be viewed as a resulting from the redescription of the ostensive pillar of early pragmatics. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much for your very fascinating presentation. If participants have questions, you can raise your virtual hand so we can see you better in the camera line. Okay, we have already one. Um, Anne, you can ask your question.
Thank you. That is really a very interesting proposal, a very neat idea about this redescribing. One thing that struck me is that you're going here from procedural knowledge to some kind of explicit knowledge, but in adults, it's usually thought that the procedure goes in the opposite direction. So how do I learn to ride a bike? First of all, I think about it as an explicit process of doing this, then doing that, and then doing the next thing. And then eventually it becomes automated and more just like procedural. So now I just jump on the bike and ride it. I don't think about all the different steps. So I just wondered whether you think there's any kind of relationship between that kind of relationship between procedural and explicit, and why is it reversed in children, that they start with the procedural and then go to the explicit?
Yeah, thank you for this question. So to answer this question, I will link the discussion to the original thinking of Carmelo Smith, because knowledge redescription, according to her view of the development of cognition and also like the mastery of more sophisticated skill, is driven not only by knowledge redescription, but also by a process of modularization. And I think that go more in the direction that you are pointing out. So modularization for Carmelo Smith is basically the process by which we basically get to so it's the other way around. We basically start to automatize a particular skill, and starting from an initial process in which we have to practice a bit more the definite step of the process. So I would say that for what concern early pragmatics and the development of pragmatics, so the direction that we are pointing out is more on the opposite direction. So first starting with acting in a spontaneous way to some specific stimuli, and then getting to have a more explicit knowledge of what is behind. So what are the intention involved, and what are the inner mechanism of this response. But of course, we leave open also the way that automatization and the development of cognition can also take another route, which is the one of modularization. So in which a process is firstly learning a sort of a more explicit way, and then go through a more implicit enactment of it.
So this is a kind of demodularization.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, for her, redescription like goes along with the process of modularization is goes along with the process of relative encapsulation of a specific ability, while in redescription is more like mm,
there is less encapsulation throughout cognitive development.
Very nice, thank you.
All right, I have a question then, if no one else wants to go first. And that pertains to basically what is required for a hidden authorship. By that I mean, is there a possibility that you can, well, do act in a hidden authorship way without necessarily redescribing knowledge into an explicit way? I agree that it increases the probabilities that the kids will can reach hidden authorship more easily if they are doing it in an explicit way. But is there also a possibility that they're doing it, but in a procedural way, fashion, a bit like they, acting instinctively wouldn't be the right term, but they have acquired the fact that if they act in a certain way, they can get certain results, but they are not explicitly manipulating ostension as a concept, if you see what I mean. So I would like your input on that, if you have possibly an answer.
Yeah, thank you for this very relevant question. So I think that's a specification that has to be done is that the sort of explicitation of knowledge does not necessarily means to have a cognitive access to the principle that guides a possible behavior such as hidden authorship. So it's not a matter of really entertaining explicitly in your mind what are the steps that you should run in order to enact an act of hidden authorship. But the interesting point in the idea of knowledge redescription is that knowledge, so there can be like a different stage of knowledge explicitation. And one of these stages has to do with the possibility of manipulating a specific principle without necessarily assessing the content of this principle. So it's not like children in the hidden authorship task are explicitly reasoning about the fact that, okay, ostension is a marker of communication. So given that ostension is not allowed, I should suppress my naturally occurring ostensive behavior and act in this way. It's more like a nuanced notion of explicitation that has to do with basically act in an appropriate way according to the contextual and communicative demands and of the situation. So it's not. I don't know if I answered to your question or if I get the point that you were answering. So basically, is like manipulating a principle which is inbuilt in your naturally occurring behavior in order to perform these more sophisticated communicative skills. Then for what concerns the cognitive correlates of hidden authorship, of course, we can think that this particular behavior requires a substantial ability to suppress a naturally and spontaneously occurring behavior. So, of course, there is executive functioning demands, inhibitory control, working memory, language ability also, because they have to keep in mind the instruction of this specific experimental setting. So of course there is there are even other cognitive demands.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I think you pretty much answered what I wanted. Thank you.